I'm Bridget Byrne, Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester and Director of the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to this final event of the 4-day conference that's organised in partnership with the Stuart Hall Foundation and the Runnymede Trust on racial inequality in a time of crisis. For those who haven't been to the other events, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about CODE. The Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity is a research centre based at the University of Manchester, but bringing together colleagues from 10 universities across the UK. Our current research programme looking at COVID, race and ethnic inequality seeks to provide a rapid response to the crisis posed by COVID and its social and cultural economic impact on racial and ethnic minorities. We're a multidisciplinary team of researchers using a range of different research methods and seeking to provide robust evidence on the often lethal impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and inequality. We aim to provide new data in accessible formats to champion policy and institutional change by showing where and how racial inequality is present, how it builds on and extends existing patterns of discrimination and inequality, and how this is experienced in everyday lives. We've launched what we hope will be the largest survey of its kind of ethnic, racial and religious minorities and how they've been impacted by the pandemic. This survey is called EVENS, the Evidence for Equality National Survey, and I'd encourage you to fill it in. There'll be more information at the end of the seminar. We're very clear that the impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and disadvantage are not one-off events, but processes that happen across the life course and across all aspects of the lives of individuals and communities. We want to understand those processes, but also working with a range of partners, we want to think about how communities are challenging discrimination and disadvantage, particularly in the wake of Black Lives Matter. We're really pleased to have this partnership with the Stuart Hall Foundation. We take on Stuart Hall's call for the aim of academic research on race and racism to change the world by challenging racial injustice and discrimination. We've also collaborated with the Stuart Hall Foundation and the Hollick Family Foundation on the Stuart Hall Race Report, which summarises the policy recommendations that have been presented over the last 40 years of tackling racial inequality in Britain. We know the problems, it's time for a change. So I'm really pleased that today's the final session is focused on culture. Stuart Hall's work has been so critical for our understanding of culture and our understanding of how important culture is as the place of making and remaking identities, individual, community and national identities. There's certainly a lot to talk about at the moment. I hope you find it informative, and please follow CODE's work on Twitter, Instagram and the web. You'll also find links to recordings of the past events of the week, the first one on policing the crisis, then health and well-being, employment and young people. You can find those through the Stuart Hall Foundation's website. So thank you very much, you're very welcome, and I want to hand over to Kay Biswas, who's going to introduce and chair this event.
Thank you, Bridget. Welcome everyone to Racial Inequality in a Time of Crisis, which is a week-long conference exploring the impact of COVID-19 on ethnic minority people in the UK. And thanks to the supporters, Runnymede Trust, Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity and the Stuart Hall Foundation. As Bridget mentioned, today is day 4 and we're speaking on culture and cultural activism. I'm Kay Biswas, I'm a critic, an editor, and one of the founders of the Racebeat, which is a journalist network for people of colour in the UK. And I'm delighted to welcome 3 wonderful speakers. Academic and author of Race and the Cultural Industries, Anamik Saha of the University of Goldsmiths and Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity. Creative producer at Counterpoint's Arts and board member of the Royal African Society, Jonah, and novelist and broadcaster Alex Wheatle, who was the subject of an episode of Steve McQueen's recent Small Acts series on the BBC. So today, this panel will explore the nature of racial inequalities and the politics of race in the cultural industries. We will attempt to look at the impact of barriers, obstacles and opportunities facing people of colour in the creative sector and how movements across access and representation fare in a time of crisis. Questions and comments for the speakers can be typed in the Q&A box. And for Twitter, Instagram and Facebook users, there's a hashtag, which is hashtag COVID Inequality UK. We'll be live tweeting from Code's Twitter account, which is at twitter.com Ethnicity UK. We'll now hear presentations from each guest, roughly 10 minutes each, before moving on to a panel discussion and finally audience questions. We will aim to finish by 6:30. So if I can introduce our first speaker, which is Anamik Saha of Goldsmiths. Thanks, Anamik.
Thank you so much, Biz, and thank you to everyone. Biz has already acknowledged all the people who are hosting this event. I also want to thank Harriet for her expert technical organizational skills. I just want to start off by very quickly reflecting on the media's coverage of the pandemic, and especially the way in which the story of how BAME communities have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And what we see rather predictably are a range of racialized discourses. So for instance, whether this kind of the spikes of COVID and the number of deaths that BAME communities have experienced, it gets blamed on our supposed biological difference, a vitamin D deficiency, or whether it's because we're failing to abide by social rules because of our ethnically determined characteristics, as though clandestine Asian weddings are solely behind the COVID spikes, in particular northern towns, for instance. Even media stories that have foregrounded poverty as an explanatory factor for why these communities have been most hit, they tend to downplay racism, whether it's in terms of access to health services or the fact that it's a disproportionate amount of racialized doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers who are working on the front line. Instead, we encounter historical discourses around overcrowded immigrant homes. I guess the point I want to make is that the crisis and the racialized discourses that it has produced has brought into focus the need for racialized communities to be able to tell their own stories and produce their own narratives on the crisis. But the fact is that these communities, they still lack proper access to the means of cultural production, or at least their entry and participation is carefully managed such that the dominant culture remains secure. The status quo stays in place, where cultural producers from underrepresented communities are placed in a form of, to quote Stuart Hall, what he calls segregated visibility. But as much as this crisis has been about COVID, it's also following the Black Lives Matter protest that has produced, if you like, a crisis in the British state and the forms of governance that it practices and enacts, where the authority of the dominant culture has been threatened. The fact that so many media and cultural institutions and organizations released, or indeed felt forced into releasing, statements in support of the Black Lives Matter, effectively making political pronouncements which they would never have, countenanced, even a year ago, I would say. I think that is something to be taken very, very seriously. So in my research with CODE, the Centre on Dynamics of Ethnicity, I've been working on a strand of the project on the impact of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter on Black, Brown and Asian people trying to enter creative and culture industries. So this involves an exploration of labour dynamics, obstacles to entry, so-called unconscious biases in recruitment practices, the politics of networking, the kind of cultures of nepotism that still persist and ensure cultural homogeneity within these spaces. But it also entails a critical analysis of, and I'm going to just do this once, diversity in scare quotes, not just in terms of checking whether these diversity initiatives are working or not, or are being implemented properly, but thinking through how diversity as a discourse actually leads to the reproduction of racial inequalities in creative and cultural industries, rather than solves them. So diversity as something that is precisely maintaining racial and other hierarchies within creative cultural industries. A recent project, a previous project that I conducted, which looked specifically at the publishing sector, specifically demonstrated or indeed reaffirmed, I felt, the limitations of current diversity policies as operationalized. diversity basically appears to be a kind of a process or based on simply just adding people from underrepresented communities adding them into organizations in a way that the dominant culture, again, another phrase from Stuart Hall, feels like it's being inclusive. But rather than the necessary transformation of those median cultural organizations, what it does, as I said, it keeps existing hierarchies in place. It is also commodified racial identities in very particular ways. That does absolutely provide some opportunities to a select few, absolutely, and we should recognize those interventions, but ultimately it keeps Black, Brown, Asian people on the margins. While we have yet to analyse the findings of the current research, when raising the issue of when raising with our interviewees the issue of the Black Lives Matter protest, there is an overwhelming sense that these statements, as you could predict, the statements that media and cultural institutions have released in support of Black Lives Matter, there is a clear sense amongst our interviewees, who are people of colour themselves, that these statements are performative. That they are, in fact, that they are more likely to lead to additional labour for those of our interviews who are already in creative culture industries, in terms of like running committees or setting up networks, and actually less actual economic opportunities. So as an example, last week, we spoke to a young Black woman who worked for a large cultural institution, one of the large cultural institutions that released a statement in support of the Black Lives Matter protest. This particular interviewee, she was on a fixed term contract in a department where she was the only person of colour. And she described the positive experience, and she described, by all accounts, everyone was very happy with her work. But as her contract ended, there was no discussion of extending it, and she was quietly released. Our respondent described a total disconnect between the statement that was released by the organisation she was working for, that kind of very defiantly said it supported Black Lives Matter. A disconnect between that statement and her own experience and her own treatment. As a racialized creative worker who could have contributed to this institution and its particular mounting of culture in terms of widening the regime of representation with regard to race and gender in particular. Of course, such institutions, organizations, companies will claim that in times of crisis, they do not have the finances to employ new staff, even when the same institutions will acknowledge that they need to do better in terms of making their organizations more diverse. As such, I argue two things. Firstly, diversity as it's conceptualized is linked to brand or reputational value. Institutions are more concerned with showing that they are doing the right thing, or they are tackling diversity in order to make their organizations appear more legitimate. It also highlights how diversity cannot avoid the question of economic redistribution. Now, the politics of representation is usually seen in opposition to the politics of redistribution, crudely put. While the latter appears to privilege class-based action, the former wants to acknowledge the cultural forms of stigmatism and stereotyping encountered in the classroom, the workplace, or media. But a radical politics of diversity needs to understand that the politics of representation and the politics of redistribution are interlinked. You cannot address one without addressing the other, as I think Stuart Hall himself would have argued. Put it another way, a politics based on visibility alone is not enough. And that's essentially what diversity initiatives in their current form, and that's all they amount to. I guess I want to just conclude by saying, in times of crisis have exacerbated this situation where institutions have a further excuse not to invest when economic redistribution, I argue, is precisely what is needed. So to finish off this short provocation, what I want to say is that when it comes to culture and cultural activism, this time of crisis highlights the limitations of diversity policy, or rather it shows how diversity is meaningless unless it's underpinned by economic redress. It's not enough to demand greater visibility. I'm sorry if our activism basically only amounts to we want to see more Black and brown people represented at the BAFTAs. I'm sorry, but I don't think that's enough. I'm all for the recognition of Black and brown excellence, don't get me wrong, but I'm not persuaded that that in itself is going to fix actual structural inequalities. In previous kind of talks that I've given, I suggest that we need to replace the benign language of diversity with a more radical language of reparative justice. That means like getting state funding, public funding of kind of BAME-led platforms, for instance, which have provided a really fertile space for people from underrepresented communities to tell their own stories and to tell their own narratives. I also, while I think it's a blunt instrument, I think we need to put the issue of affirmative action back on the table too. I mean, it's interesting that when I speak to people in the culture industries, when I speak to the people behind these organizations, everyone is on the diversity bandwagon. But the minute you start talking about affirmative action, people start feeling very, very defensive. You get a very, very defensive response. So that's essentially where I maybe we can develop some of those things, those issues in the discussion. But essentially, you know, I know a lot of what I've said isn't really that new, you know, kind of diversity as superficial, tokenistic, Black Lives Matter statements, you know, as performative. But nonetheless, what I think this crisis does show is how we need a form of cultural activism that incorporates and is underpinned, as I said, by a politics of economic redress. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anamik. That was a fascinating setting out of the stall about where we are in 2021. If you've got questions for Anamik or any of the other panelists, please put them in the Q&A. And I'm delighted to welcome our second speaker, which is Jonah from Counterpoint's Arts. Hi, Nike. Would you like to start your presentation? We've got 10 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you again to Code and Stuart Hall for inviting me to speak. It's so interesting to listen to you, Anamik, and it's kind of, when I do these talks, I often listen to other speakers and then I shift a little bit. And I kind of wanted to just pick up on a point that he mentioned about this affirmative action and how people kind of get a bit freaked out about it. And I always remember a friend of mine was in a session one time. It was a sort of Q&A session. He was a journalist at the time. And he reminded Boris Johnson when he was the mayor of London that the best and biggest, most successful affirmative action initiative in the world is the Old Boys Network. And I think we need to think about what they do in order to, you know, hold the power, to keep the power. We've seen lots of horrendous examples during this pandemic of how their mates have been brought in and what that looks like when you start bringing in friends to sort of, you know, take care of business that they have no business being in. So over the course of the last year now, gosh, can't believe I haven't left the country for over a year. I'm doing a lot of reading and thinking and searching and rethinking life, my work. I think I've always been in this space of equality and diversity. I kind of formalized it at my time at the Arts Council, and I want to tell you a little bit about that experience. And I'm going to start off by talking about a lady I only came across her in October, and I started to read a lot more and just seek out just answers and trying to make sense of everything. And it's, you know, Peggy McIntosh. She wrote a paper called White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And she asked us to consider how we design social systems. So a lot of what Anamik's been talking about. And that before you even start that, you need to think about these colossal unseen dimensions. And two of the core values that she mentions, I kind of want to kind of frame within the arts industry. And I kind of, to quote Baldwin, do I really want to be integrated in the burning house? And that's been my question quite a bit. During lockdown, with all these huge organizations, V&A, Tate, South Bank, you know, having, you know, 80% furloughs, while a lot of smaller organizations like Counterpoint's Arts continue to do the work. They're flexible, they're agile, they're responding to the needs of the sector and trying to keep the sector up, prop the sector up and be there. And I think we need to think about what we're trying to ask ourselves that we want to be part of. So it's about, do we want to be, it's this whole thing about being, to be accepted by us, you have to accept our standards. And those standards often are around aesthetics and taste, which are often Eurocentric and racialized. And the understanding of these expectations are that the social systems in the arts are structurally elitist, but also racist. We know that. They need to be acknowledged and addressed, and also dismantled. And the second of McIntosh's dimensions for me was all questions around arts funding, the source from which the funding comes from, who determines, who leads the funding initiatives, the selection process, assessment panels. When I was working at Decibel in the Arts Council, it was an initiative set up to support African, Asian and Caribbean at the time, and they were generally recognised as the most underrepresented group that the Arts Council wanted to focus on. To be a Black person at the Arts Council, leading quite a large, I wasn't leading it for the whole time, leading quite a large budget, I know what we went through, and I know the sort of threats and horrible fax messages, like threatening messages that we got because simply we were Black. And these were people from within the sector that are so-called liberal. So I think there's an ebb and flow to way race relations work in these organisations, and there's always been these repeated calls for change, and they're often quite temporary and they're kind of transient catalysts for change, but they don't really do anything. And I just think the diversification of the arts is often just a tick box. You present people in venues and organizations, chief exec, artistic director. I mean, in the space of the last few years, we've got about 14 people of colour leading theatre institutions in London. But when you go and dig behind the scenes, you find out that often they've inherited poison chalice, the organization's bankrupt, or there isn't the right resource, or they have to do a hell of a lot of heavy lifting to bring it to a space where it becomes an enjoyable place to work. And to kind of go further, while I was at the Arts Council, this programme that I said was designed for African, Asian and Caribbean artists that were underrepresented. It was all off the back of the Race Equality scheme that Arts Council had developed, and this was under the back of the beginning of the Single Equality Act. This ultimate failure of this funding initiative was £10 million. It was a 10-year programme, and you can't but help ask the question of what went wrong. Arts Council got restructured in 2012, and Decibel disappeared. No announcements, no legacy plans, no proper interrogation of its impact. And of course, on the surface, if Arts Council presents and says, we invested 10 million, you would even be fooled into thinking that they're really serious. But how can you spend 10 million on a program and it disappeared? There was no, this is what's going to happen next. It literally just stopped. I went to another department and then I left shortly after that. But in parallel, there were other initiatives that were all set up in the Arts Council, Own Art, Creative Partnership Programme, that were all established as permanent entities in the arts sector. For me, it was clear that Decibel was not subject to the same scrutiny and assessment regarding its future as other Arts Council-driven initiatives that were not the focus of diversity. And to further add, similar to what Anamik said about this lady that was brought in, it's just, you come in and then nothing happens. The two initiatives that shut down were Decibel, led, by the time I left, it was led by me, and Creative Leadership Programme led by Hilary Carty, who's a woman of colour. And it was interesting, the two women of colour's initiatives didn't go anywhere. And it wasn't for one to try and I think for me, I've been really thinking about this. And I think there's a merit in an argument or an analysis that I came across recently that talks about this failure, not as a failure, but more of a successful outcome of something that's termed diversity resistance within institutions and organizations. And give yourself a chance to think about that, because looking at this report that was just produced, over and over again, the same themes come up, just slightly different language, slightly different ways of talking about diversity. But I can't help but feeling that somewhere along the line we've been conned. I don't think it's all grim. I think there's lots of things we can do. Once you have an awareness, you can start to find new ways to really look and unpack things. And I think with the current pandemic, of course, this exposed long-term impact that discrimination and disadvantages continue to have, particularly on the lives of people of colour. A higher death rate with COVID, the public murder of George Floyd, it serves as a harsh reminder of the racial equality still prevalent in today's society. And of course, recently, all the supposedly outlandish revelations that came from Harry and Meghan. I mean, nobody in my network found them at all kind of surprising at all. And I think for me, the key lessons are there are no quick and easy ways to dismantle this corrosive structure. There needs to be constant dialogue, constant vigilance, discourse in the arts itself, with a realization at the core that the overt racism and the covert go hand in hand. We often focus on the overt because that's what people know, that's what people recognize, but the covert needs to be unpacked. Behind every overt action, there's a support of covert institutional structures and prejudicial attitudes that top it up. And the problem cannot always be clearly seen from the inside. So I'm going to stop there because I think my time's up, but it's not all grim. I think there's lots of positive things to come about having this awareness. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nike. That was wonderful. If you've got questions for Nike, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them for the final 20 minutes of the session. Our final presentation for the next 10 minutes will be from Alex Wheatle. Alex is a novelist who was also the subject of one of the episodes of the BBC's recent Small Axe series with Steve McQueen. And maybe, Alex, you can talk about your own experiences within the cultural industries for the next 10 minutes. Thanks.
Yes. Let me take on Nike's point about the Arts Council and funding and how that was dealt with and how that was distributed. And it brings to mind my experience of something like 20 years ago when my book was optioned for a theatrical run at a particular theatre in East London. And I remember the writer who adapted the piece and the director. They were very esteemed in the business, very well thought of, critically acclaimed, but it seemed script draft. We went to the artistic director for meetings, and this artistic director, who was white, would say to us, "Oh, I'm not quite getting this. I don't quite understand this. I'm not sure if our audience will understand this." There's always reasons and barriers put in our way why we couldn't greenlight this theatrical event. And it led to deep frustration within me. It really did. I mean, we was on this project for something like 2 to 3 years. And in that time, we kind of just gave up, basically, that we felt it'd never get a greenlit successful book. It was well known. In fact, where this particular theatre was located, I visited local schools around that area, and the book was very popular. So there was no question that if it was given a green light, it would have been a great success, in my opinion. And so that led to other frustrations. My second novel, East of Acre Lane, that was optioned by the BBC. And the person who optioned it was a BAFTA award-winning producer. And so I thought, hey, yes, this is going to be on the BBC. This is going to be great. And, I was very much looking forward to it. This is before, this is at the time where I thought everything was possible if you was a writer, where if you created a good piece of work, then you had a fair chance that it might be adapted for television. And so especially as it was a BAFTA award-winning producer, I thought, yes, here we go. But the same thing occurred like it did with Bricks in the Rock, with my theatrical experience. when they had a writer who had been in the business for many years. He had written scripts for the Bill and other productions, drama productions on BBC, ITV, and Channel 4. And yet, when he completed drafts 1, 2, 3, 4, we would meet up with the people who had power in the BBC, the drama controller, and so on, drama commissioner, and they would repeat the same mantra as what we heard in the theatrical world. Oh, I'm not quite sure if Middle England would get this. This could be too political. Could you change this? Could you change that? This is too kind of aggressive towards Margaret Thatcher and so on. But, you know, it was about 1981, and there was this deep, deep frustration. And again, the BBC optioned it for something like 3 years. We gave up with the BBC, and then Channel 4 optioned it, and we went through the same old process where they just didn't feel comfortable with the material that we was producing. And so at the end of the day, it was not commissioned. And funny enough, going to 2020, where Small Axe was greenlit, and there were elements of East of Acre Lane that made it into my episodes. So that was kind of like a karma for me, really, because I'd use certain aspects of my life to inform that book. So, you know, I was kind of nodding in a kind of sage way that at least there were 2 or 3 scenes that actually made the final cut of my episode. But it was a very hard journey to get anything greenlit. And when I look back now, the artistic directors I met, say 20 years ago, who were interested in my work or even had a discussion about my work, 99% of them were white. I think I can only remember Talawa and Jatinda Verma at Tara Arts down in Wandsworth, who were artistic directors of colour. I'd be happy to hear of any more who were operating in London at that time. So it was really, really difficult to get any of our narratives greenlit. Really, really difficult for actors to build a career. I mean, I know a number did, but there were so many talented actors who I met and who I was inspired by, who you know, spent too much time serving customers in cafeterias and working in being air hostesses on airlines and so on, and not letting not being kind of not being allowed to let their talents flow. It's so frustrating for many of the creators, black creators, around 15, 20 years ago. And so we jumped forward towards the time of COVID. And I had a play, Crompton Nights, that I was incredibly happy about the way that was commissioned by Pilot Theatre. And it was a very diverse cast, a young cast. So we was offering roles for people in our community from differing backgrounds, Muslim, Black, whatever. And I was very excited by that. It began its run at the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry. And then it went on to Manchester, it went on to Brighton, and just before it came to London, obviously COVID happened, so it had to be cancelled and postponed. And I was really thinking at that time, you know, I've come a long way in terms of getting my work adapted and seeing other people's work get adapted. People like Coulter and friends of mine who are, you know, are in my field. And I had a discussion with many 2-3 years ago, and we was kind of excited that things are actually happening, things are changing. There are opportunities now. You know, there's not just 99% white artistic directors who run theatres and make the decisions and so on. So I was really excited. But COVID, I think, to a certain extent, has paused that. And I'm really hoping that this momentum that we had going back, say, 5 years is continued when theatres can open, when opportunities can start to be greenlit, and that they won't go back to the old, we're not sure whether this will suit a middle-class audience or a Middle England audience and so on. They just accept our stories. They value our stories. They put worth in our histories and our narratives. That's what I'm really looking forward to. And coming to Small Axe now, yes, if you like, the episodes, the 5 episodes, is a depiction, some might say, of black pain, and I wouldn't argue against that. But what we're really trying to do with that series is just open up the field, say, look, this is one aspect of our narrative, and what we're really hoping is that other people will be allowed. Because we have to remember, Steve McQueen was refused by the BBC some years ago about this series, and he had to go and make of his directing career. So the BBC then wanted to speak to him, and I really hope to America and maybe all the UK to come to us and sit down with us and say, okay, what do you want to do? So I really hope that there's young creatives out there after the terrible consequences of COVID can actually go to organisations like theatres, big theatres in London or in our major cities, and come with an idea and come with one of our narratives that is a great narrative, and not have to jump through all these hoops that we so often have to jump through, hoops of fire to prove that our stories are worthwhile, to prove that they're valuable. Just take our stories on merit. They're fantastic stories, and I'm really hoping we'll continue once we're allowed in theatres, once writers can bring their stories to those artistic directors, wherever they may be, and this momentum that we had does not get paused. So I want to see romance, I want to see sci-fi, I want to see all kinds of genres filling our creative spaces, not just about our black pain. And that's what I worry about, that commissioners in the BBC or elsewhere might say, oh, okay, you see Alex Wheatle, oh God, that made me cry. Let's broaden it out. And I know there are stories out there, black creators, they're black and brown creators, they're writing as we speak. They really are. So that's what I'm hoping for at the as COVID comes to an end. Well, hopefully it comes to an end, that this momentum will continue, and we will see a broadening of our stories, of our narrative, in all forms of expression, theatre, film, television, and so on. So that's what I'm really hoping to see. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alex. If you have questions for Alex or any of our other amazing panelists, please put them in the Q&A. For the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to open it up to a panel discussion before we come to the Q&A. And I think all three of you have touched upon this point, but clearly the last year of both COVID and the lockdown and the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movements, peak after the death of George Floyd in the US, is clearly an important year in cultural expression for communities of colour in the UK. How do you think historically it will go down, the culture created in the last year? I think to sort of situate the point, until the 1950s, culture, or what was deemed culturally worthy, was largely dictated by a narrow social and economic pool of a kind of moneyed leisure class. And like well into the 1950s, the big cultural institutions in Britain were run by this class. Everything from the BBC to the Arts Council, and also private enterprises circulated what could be considered British cultural life. And it's only from the extension of secondary education and waves of migration that took place that actually the outsider perspective was given a voice. So we, as communities of colour, have only really had a voice for about 70 years in this country for the history of culture. So how does 2020 to 2021 fit in that history?
In a way, I find that frustrating also, because it seems like everything, everyone paid attention to what happened with George Floyd. And I was thinking to myself, but wait a minute, Ethan Brown deaths in custody in this country for years, going back to the 1960s, what, even before the 1960s. You know, there's been marches, there's been protests, there's been all kinds of things. And yet, why do we seem to tend to look for America, for the UK to say to themselves, okay, this is enough now, we need to start something, we need to start a conversation. And so for me, that wasn't, of course it was regrettable and painful for everybody and quite triggering for someone like myself to see what, you know, a black man die in real time on our television screens. But for me, organizations, I mean, to use that to say, okay, we haven't done enough. They hadn't done enough for years. Maybe, I don't know, because I'm in my 50s now and I've got baggage and so on. So, I'm saying to myself, they're finally catching up with how I felt for many, many years. That's how I feel about it.
And just to pick up on that, I think if I look at 2020 and 2021, we're seeing a huge shift in the cultural sector. Number of the people that lost their jobs, that didn't have access to furlough, that didn't have redundancy, were people of colour. They often weren't in the jobs that were valued. So you can look at examples of the Tate and the South Bank and now the V&A. So for me, I think the sector is going to look very different. And I'm trying to work out what, if it is going to improve because there's this push that's linked to Black Lives Matter, to link to people kind of having an awareness and wanting to have more people of colour on staff. I mean, I know, like a lot of my friends in the arts sector will get in calls to do all sorts of things. A lot of the times, the big organisations that really want to maintain the status quo, they want to keep doing what they were doing before COVID, sort of February last year. They asked us to come in and retrofit, if you like, make it look like we've been doing the right thing. And so I don't know, I think it's going to be interesting. I think there's some interesting voices that are beginning to come out. I think we're thinking more global. I think when I hear organizations like Google and other big organizations say, you can work for us at a decent salary wherever you are in the world, I start to think, what does that do for people in Africa who often leave to come and advance their economic status, to find ways? What does it do for someone in Nigeria who now says, I don't have to go to Lagos to get a job. I can stay home, work from home, but working for international companies from my desk. And we're beginning to do that a little bit more now. But this is what's got me, this is where I think the possibilities could be very interesting indeed. Because nobody thinks about where you're situated now. They think, well, as long as they've got internet connection and they can use Zoom or one of these virtual spaces, meeting spaces, we can have access to them. And I think it opens up the opportunity to bring in voices from Africa. I deal a lot in the Africa space beyond the work I do with Counterpoint. I also run a showcase in South Africa for artists based on the continent to be able to advance their practice. And it's because they could never get a visa to get off, just to even attend a conference. So I think all of that's going to shift, and I'm quite interested to see what happens. I think it could be, I'm quite an optimistic person. I think it could be quite positive.
Anamik, are you as optimistic as Nico?
No, do you know what? As much as I mean, firstly, it's just been such a pleasure to be on this panel with Nico and Alex, and everything they said really, really chimed with me. And I've got to be honest, as much as I'm so critical of the discourses of diversity in media, as much as I don't want to for a second I just want to constantly expose the structural inequalities. And to be honest, the research that I'm doing with Code at the moment, where we're speaking to young people of colour who are trying to get into, or at least started working in creative and cultural industries, I'm sorry to say, it feels pretty bleak, actually. But saying that, there's something about what Nike is saying that does kind of, that does make me feel what, optimistic. I don't know, but there's glimmers of hope. Let's say that. And I think what Nike was saying about the globalized nature of our media consumption, I think is true. We can consume more easily kind of narratives from around the world, and not just other Western contexts, not just the US, in ways that we've never been able to do so before. There is something about the way in which media and cultural organizations, they can't get away with just having, entirely white cast sitcoms anymore, for instance. They just can't get away with it. In fact, and Alex, you can speak to this, a lot of the publishers that I spoke to for my previous research, they're very much aware. To be honest, that they're institutionally white, but it's mostly driven by fear that they're going to be called out, because basically what has happened is that audiences and communities can talk back to power, to use that millennial term, in ways that we've never been able to before. And these, like the publishing houses I spoke to, they are, I met a lot of people who do feel a genuine need, but they are running scared. And so there is something going on there, which I hope is going to present more opportunities. I've got to be honest with you, in this research project, at the moment, it's actually quite upsetting listening to some of these narratives from these young people who just feel, it's really interesting actually. What we're finding is that they are talking about their struggles, about, trying to get in. They always talk about how they're not able to access networks. They always talk about how they reflect upon how they don't feel they have good networking skills, and that's what's holding them back. It's funny how we kind of try and push them into thinking about racial discrimination, and they don't talk about it in those terms. They can't, because I guess if they kind of succumb to the industry's races, then what hope does that give you, right? How do you, so it's almost kind of like a form of self-protection, where you kind of just think, it's on me, it's me. I've just got to improve my skills. I've got to be more social. I've got to be able to talk to, the people who run these organizations. So it is, I kind of feel a little bit torn on it. But to be honest with you, in these bleak times, I'd rather hang on to what Nike was saying just now, actually.
What I love about being on a panel with just people of colour is we all know that the existing diversity schemes are kind of not fit for purpose. And that, it's not that we're seeking kind of a bit more extra funding of existing schemes or anything. What was quite interesting after the BLM, I suppose, movement from the US to the UK was, in my capacity as like a founder of the Racebeat, I got a lot of calls from established media organizations saying, what do we do now? And what was interesting compared to the past, when if you pointed out structural racism in the cultural industries, people would hide behind their existing diversity scheme, which was usually unpaid, had terrible retention rates. This time, a lot of people admitted that the schemes were crap and they needed to do more. So I just wanted to kind of fillet this idea about how established cultural institutions can go further than extending existing diversity schemes. What do you three think they can do to go further than that?
I think if I give an example of the Arts Council, there's something that Canada Council did that really sits with me. The chief executive of the Canada Council, I saw him at a conference in Mexico, and he talked about how 25% of their funding budget was going to go to people who've never had funding before. And what followed for me is something it kind of gave me the chills. And he said, what do we need to look like in order to make that happen? That's what he said. We're going to have to change internally. Arts Council sometimes all well-meaning, and some of these institutions are all well-meaning. But if you've got the same people making decisions with the same narrow gaze, you're going to get the same thing. You have to have someone that thinks different, that comes from a different background, that can just help see the work for what it is. An example, a colleague of mine is working with an Asian guy who runs this amazing theatre company. He's been trying to get core funding from the Arts Council for years. Every time he presents a show, it's 82 to 92% sold out. And people in theatre know that is a good, always, constantly. And they always talk about his work being emergent, and he had a particular character that he was using in his play was a doctor. And he had to say to the Arts Council, he's not emerging, he's just trained differently. And it's about them valuing also that people, I trained as a designer. I'm now on the board of the Bush, I'm at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. I've changed as a fashion designer, but I've learned, I've picked up things as I've gone along, and I've had a lot of support and guidance, and I've educated myself. And to be honest with you, I don't even think I would have got a job at the Arts Council if I hadn't freelanced with them for 4 months. And then they sort of liked what I did and said, apply. I wouldn't even have known what to say to even sustain myself in the organisation, because I didn't even understand the way they spoke half the time. I'd say, what is that, a dessert? Is it Latin? What is it? Because it was all this coded language, which is incredibly intimidating if you're not coming from the space. And it took me a good 4 years to recognise that actually I was okay there, and I was contributing, I was actually making a difference. But it's, if you're not confident to kind of sort of go sometimes down the road less traveled, it can really take a knocking on your mental health. And I always remember what David Olusoga talked about in his McTaggart lecture of how many people leave the sector because the culture of the sector is not set up to support them. So I think the organisations have to really commit to shifting the people who are making decisions on all levels inside, how they view and how they articulate excellence, like Alex said. How many times does the guy have to keep going back and forth? At what point, as a person of colour, as someone of his standing, do you stop being an emerging? You're not emerging, you're struggling to get your things onto the table. So I think respecting the space of cognitive labour, all the work that you put in order to get that onto the table because you're not part of the networks, all of that needs to be, for me, it needs to be built into the funding. So if I'm going to sit and write an application and it takes 6 weeks, there's got to be a way that I'm compensated for that. And the infrastructure is a mess. When you go now back to Canada, they've got a huge push on First Nations people. I did about 4 or 5 things in Canada every time I'm meeting First Nations people. They're always telling me that actually things are getting better. They feel they're beginning to move forward. So I think the organisations have to change inside, and they have to really commit to that long-term, not a 3 short-term contract. They have to really commit.
Both Alex and Anamik, you understand the publishing sector very, very well. I just wanted to ask you how you feel the publishing sector has reacted.
I think in the main, they reacted quite positively. Obviously, there's work to be done. In my experience, when I was first acquired by one of the mainstream publishers, basically they had very low expectations of me. Even though I was receiving incredible reviews for East of Acre Lane, they seemed to be happy that I was doing local events in Brixton Library. They had no interest of sending me to any of the major literary festivals, none at all. In fact, that was something that in my career I struggled with, trying to get them to take an interest of my work being read by a far greater audience, but they just refused to see that, even though they liked me on their list as, oh, look, we got a black author on our list. So I felt like a token, I really did. And it's only when, just referring to the question that we received in the chat, it's only when I moved to YA where the publisher recognized that I could go into schools of diverse communities, or anywhere really, and I could sell, I could be important, and so the publisher started thinking, wow, Alex Wheatle is going to Devon and selling books there, he's going to Wales, he's going to here, he's going to there, and he's selling, he's popular. And then all of a sudden, I was going to Edinburgh, I was going to Cheltenham, I was going further afield, I was going to Dubai, I was going to New Zealand, I was going to South Africa. And so sometimes publishers still don't see the potential of black authors because you can get pigeonholed even today, especially in literary fiction. It seems like if they don't spend a great deal of money on the author, and then that, especially if you're a black author, you can be left to your own means like I was, and to find gigs for yourself. And so it's only if they, you know, they will consider you as sending you for all these great literary events that they do for most writers on a big publishing list. And so hopefully that will change. I mean, in the past 2, 3, 4 years, we have seen publishers actually spending money on marketing campaigns for their writers of color, you know, writers on their list who happen to be of writers of color. And so I'm encouraged by that. But in saying that, I'm also seeing a lessening, if you like, of black writers, black male writers, black UK male writers. I don't see too much of them published by the mainstream publishers anymore. There's been non-factual books, non-fiction books, but not so much fiction. And so I'm very concerned about that and how many are they acquiring every year for the mainstream publishers. So I'm monitoring that situation because it seems that when I was published, there was me, Courtney Leland, Stephen Thompson, there was a whole bunch of us breaking through. But I haven't seen that breakthrough with black UK male authors in the last few years. So I'm wondering what's going on there. What is happening there? Are they submitting to agents? Are they submitting to publishing houses? Or are they kind of like at one point in my career, dismayed and probably going into other creative forms, poetry, stand-up, music, whatever. I mean, that could be a phenomenon as well. We don't know. It'd be nice to see what literary agents receive in their in-trays, I think. Maybe that could be Anamik's next study.
I was gonna say, Anamik, maybe you can expand upon this idea of representation versus redistribution and how that kind of works in practical terms in the cultural industries.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, I guess so much kind of cultural activism around media especially seems to be diversity gets seen in terms of visibility. So are we seeing marginalized, underrepresented communities? I mean, well, by virtue of being underrepresented, we're not, but you know what I mean, of minoritized communities. And I'm just worried if that's the end goal, because like I said, the way in which diversity is operationalized, as I've encountered in my research, seems to be about like, how can we add more Black, Brown, Asian bodies to our institutions while keeping the status quo intact, right? Keeping the structures intact. As I've said in the past, kind of slightly provocatively, but like white privilege isn't going to dismantle itself, right? And so in terms of like, I am less concerned these days. I mean, Alex, you kind of really talked about the complexities of the politics of representation, about, you know, if kind of Black pain is all we see, but also sometimes if you look on Netflix, Black, Brown and Asian people are having a whale of a time. You know, like on all those shows we see on Netflix. And that seems equally as problematic as well, because actually this isn't really the reality, so for us, in terms of what we encounter on the streets, in our workplaces, in institutions that we belong to. So when I talk about economic redress, I'm talking about ways in which we can support Black, Brown, Asian creativity. What's been really exciting in the past few years is that emergence of like these new platforms where what's really interesting is not just that those platforms are giving voice to Black, Brown, Asian communities and other underrepresented communities, but actually they're created for themselves. So they're created for their communities. So it's kind of like they're having discussions amongst themselves, which is a wonderful thing, because actually part of the problem when I found in publishing and this research is part of the problem with its efforts at diversity and trying to diversify its workforce is that they have a very narrow conception of who their audience is, i.e. an older white middle class reader. And if you're kind of an underrepresented, if you're from a marginalized background, you need to be seen as having value to this single white reader in order to, which is why our narratives always end up fulfilling the same tropes. You know, I know if I want to get published, I need to write about some kind of arranged marriage or being caught between two cultures, or, you know, like, like living a secret life away from beyond what my parents can see. So I want to see, I'm interested in kind of public funding for those platforms. What would that look like? Obviously, the Arts Council play a big role in that. At times, I've kind of experimented with ring fencing. Maybe Nike can tell us about what she thinks what has worked and what hasn't. But But I do want to, you know, I'm kind of also, Nika, you kind of were riffing off that notion of affirmative action. I know that's like scary language, also for people of color as well as the dominant white culture. No one wants to be a diversity hire, right? But
they all are, though. They all are. It's just their own, it's an image of themselves. That's the point that I was making.
Exactly, about the old boys network. Exactly, that's total, as you say, completely. That is just affirmative action. Like, it's actually happening right now.
Well, before we go to answering the questions that the audience are leaving in the chat, maybe we could have a quick kind of one sentence from each of you about how to undermine this old boys network, how to circumvent the old boys network for people of color, because I think we've all in our industries experienced that kind of wall that's put up in front of you as a person of color when dealing and trying to, you know, be a part of the creative industries, and kind of having, you know, doors slammed in your face. So are there ways of circumventing existing old boys networks?
We seem to have this thing in the UK that Cambridge and Oxford is king. No, it's not. We can have just as much skilled people or creatives coming from any corner of the country or any corner of the world. I don't know why in the creative field that we always look, oh, because they studied at Oxford or because they studied drama at Cambridge or whatever, that they're in some way superior. That is not in my experience. You know, so we need to just kind of have a different mindset of how we look on people and how we employ people, not for what they accomplished, whatever university they've been to or what creative field they come from, but just by just being them, just employ them for them being creative as an individual, rather than always looking to this same old journeys into organizations. I think that will help.
Can I just, sorry, Nick, do you mind if I just riff off something Alex said there? I just want to, before I forget it, oh no, I have forgotten it. No, that's it. I think in order for our narratives to be shown, the dominant culture needs to understand it. Otherwise, we don't get commissioned, we don't get given a platform. So I want to be able to, I love it, those moments where we see success based on the creation of culture that dominant culture, that isn't for them, and that they don't get. And we see it in music all the time, actually. We see it in music all the time. But, you know, undeniably, I'm just thinking of, like, I just showed a clip to my students yesterday of, like, that comedian, forget his name, Hamza. He was behind Diary of a Bad Man, right, which was a very popular YouTube series, especially amongst young people. And he's a comedian, and he's doing this interview with Romesh Ranganathan, who is, you know, a kind of another famous brand comedian, albeit one that's gone through the traditional route of playing, you know, like random pubs in Croydon to one man and his dog. And Hamza's in this interview, Hamza's describing his first gig is at like Wembley Arena, or like in front of 3,000 people. It's a headline show. He's doing half an hour. And Romesh is like, what the fuck? You haven't paid your and Hamza's like, no, I did this web series. I've done this gig and 3,000 people turn up. And he's basically, as you said, Biz, he's circumnavigated that entire industry. And there's something very powerful about that, you know, and I'm loving seeing those moments right now.
And Nike, because you've worked with smaller arts organizations, how do you face up to the big boys within the industry?
Oh, do you know what? I think I do a lot of work behind the scenes. So I sit on a number of boards. I go and speak on panels in different places around the world, and sometimes when you're abroad, people take you in more than if you're in your own country. And I've been lucky. When I first left the Arts Council, I could barely get hired here. I think I pissed off a lot of people, and then I sort of started to kind of trickle back. But I think just to kind of answer your point, and it's something I've banged on to you about in the past, I just think we need to work to develop our critical voices. The critics are often white men. And I sit on the board of the Bush Theatre, and we did a play, something that was an amazing play called Misty. And I remember before I went to see it as a board member, there was 2 white critics who basically boiled it down to, oh, it's a play about London, totally missed all the other sort of layers in the play, and it wouldn't really travel. By the time it got to the West End, because it transferred to the West End, people from all over the world are looking at it. It's just picked up a transfer in New York. And I said to the team, I said, where are the voices of the people that understand what Arinde Kenny, the writer, was trying to say? I mean, how are we going to have these two guys who completely didn't understand anything about him, his culture, his background? So I'm really big about having more critical voices in the space. And it really comes off the back of a blog that I read about a lady that went to see a play at the Public Theatre in New York. I don't recall the name of the play. And she said, sort of 2/3 of the way through the play, the Black male character died and they left the body on the stage, right? She said, so when she was one Black critic out of 23 white critics. She said, when she now went to read everyone's write-up, not one person mentioned what that Black man's body staying on stage meant. I completely didn't recognize this was about the violence on Black men's body in America. Totally missed it. And she said, what does that do to arts? What does that do to the artist, the form, the tension that you need between a critic and an artist if you don't have real critical that artists need? And this, for me, I feel really passionate about two things: criticism and archives, very good archives.
As a critic myself, whose last piece appeared on the front page of the New York Times a year ago, who no British organisation has followed up on, I fully support your point of view there, Nike. More archives and more critics of colour. We can move on to the Q&A for the final 20 minutes of the session. And there's some wonderful questions coming in. Please carry on posting them. I thought we may start with a question from Maya, who says, how do we make sure that mainstream white-led organisations who are waking up to racism don't hoover up funding and occupy the space that long-established Black, brown, global majority organisations created, and that those organisations don't get pushed further to the margins?
I think that's a good point, and I think twofold. We've got to put pressure on those organisations that hoover up the funding to allow. We at Counterpoint made a decision around the time of the pandemic not to go for certain funding because we recognised we're actually in an okay place and that actually there's other people that their survival might be reliant on it. So we made that decision because we're very aware of the people around us. I think the other tool that people don't realise is that public sector duty, which actually the Arts Council weren't required to do it. So basically, as part of the Single Equality Act 2010, there was a duty that said, if you're in receipt of public funds, you must demonstrate legally that you are making sure that all the people that you work with, all the people that you fund, that even the service providers, even everyone is actually passing on that duty. So making sure that they also are doing the right thing. And I noticed last year, when I looked at the Arts Council's new 10-year strategy, they've put that back in. And I'd be interested to see two things: how they implement it and monitor that and really make sure that organizations are doing it, and who they're going to ensure does that. Because to me, I think the big heavyweight 28 million a year organizations should be forced to do it and they should be monitored. So I'd be interested to know how they monitor that, because I think you're actually right, Maya. This comes up all the time, and we're seeing all these people popping up with diversity programs, and the people who've been doing it for years who might not have the networks are still struggling or still getting 50 quid when their counterparts are getting 50,000. So all of this, we need to shift that. We need to kind of keep pushing on that.
I agree with what Nike says. And just going back to my experiences with the theatre world, especially 15, 20 years ago, I know for a fact that there were certain theatre houses in London and in the major cities who would clean up development money. They would get development money for Black or brown projects and whatever. But those artists knew that they would never get green lighted. They just get the development money because they were ticking boxes. You know, oh, you know, we've spent money on this development and that development, but nothing would ever get greenlit.
Well, maybe a
It's a
follow-up
problem looking at
question.
money that would be better served for small organisations.
Well, there was an additional question in the chat from Tom saying, given the defunding of leading Black theatres like Talawa and the Nia Centre in Manchester, should we be thinking about the current racial inequalities in cultural production as a direct consequence of racist policymaking rather than just a lack of progress?
To be honest, I had a bit of a problem with Talawa because sometimes, or most of the time, I felt, in my opinion, that they were not doing original works from Black writers. They seemed to be just doing waiting to Godot, another copy, white male, whatever, 100 or so years ago. And so I always had an issue with that. So I don't know, maybe someone else can answer the rest of the question, but I always kind of resist arts councils or any funding organisation giving money to organisations, Black organisations, all because they're repeating stories and narratives that white people have written.
I think you've got a point. I think sometimes it's because the whole question of risk, the whole question of the values and aesthetics that come in when you're bringing in new playwrights or unknown playwrights that they're challenged with, that sometimes they're taking a route that is about survival. And when I sat on the board of the Bush interviews, when Lynette Linton was appointed as the new chief exec, and I think the hardest thing, it still brings tears to my eyes, is reading 60 applications and knowing at least half of them could do the job, and we could only choose one person. And hearing from people who've had to take that route in order to be respected by the arts sector, and seeing an organisation like the Bush and thinking, I can be me, I can do anything I want here because I will get the backing of the board and the organisation, and realising that they didn't have a voice in what, they'd forgotten why they came into theatre in the first place, because they got worn down and they're having to make these decisions about going with the canon rather than the things that made them be in theatre in the first place. And I think there's something about, for me, I feel like there has to be a space for healing, especially for those theatre makers that Alex refers to from back in the day, that had to do that in order to kind of keep the funding and to be seen as like part of the sector, to be able to go away and remember, like, what is it that I love about theatre? How do I remember? How do I make that work again? Because I think the Bush Theatre's interview panels, the decisions might have looked very different if Madney, when he announced he was leaving, he said he's leaving in September. And I think we did the interviews in October. If we'd done the interviews in February, where people had time to think about what is my dream program, I think it might have looked very different, because I think people had to remind themselves. When I left the Arts Council, I remember this senior lady bumped into me and she said to me, have you found your voice? And I said, you know what? I didn't even realize that's what was missing. I couldn't articulate what was missing when I left. Scared to say certain things, never put anything on social media. And I realized I'd been silenced. So I think there's something about that we have to kind of be aware of.
Yeah, no, in my own research on the arts, I've kind of, what I've found is that, again, it's about the dominant culture, and you know, so many organizations, in order to kind of get access, say, ring-fenced money specifically for culturally diverse arts, end up needing to, they feel like they need to perform their cultural diversity in a way that the dominant culture understands. So that leads to the kind of reproduction of particular tropes, blackness and Asianness and so on. Also, I think what's interesting, I mean, Tom's original question is precisely my argument, is that it's not so much diversity initiatives aren't working, it's just that they're designed in a way that actually reproduces racial inequalities. But what's happening as well in the arts, and again, I'll defer to Nico and Alex, who've got direct experience on this, but we're seeing a marketization of this sector, right? So it's about, you know, the artistic director is like a manager now. He's working, he or she's working with like spreadsheets and kind of cost benefit charts and all these kind of mechanisms, which kind of, they don't lead to kind of radical forms of art. It leads to, it's tick boxing. It kind of leads to, you know, kind of decisions based on like rationalization, and which don't serve, I mean, put it this way, they don't serve underrepresented communities. I just want to very quickly, in light of like Maya's question as well, and what Nick and Alex were just talking about, my brilliant colleague Claire Alexander, who's at Code, shared an article with me about from a publication called The Tribe Arts, rather. I think they're a theatre company in Leeds. I'm just going to send it to everyone. But basically, kind of seems, the research shows that out of 313 organisations that applied for, I guess, ring-fence money for BAME-led organisations, just under 15% of these were factually BAME-led. So there's something going on there. I mean, I haven't really investigated that story myself, but this was just something that was shared to me. But it just kind of shows how these policies are, you know, these people are gaming the system in that way, which kind of I find really, really troubling. So yeah, there's lots of things I just threw on the page there. I don't know what.
How does that work? How can you apply for funding meant for a BAME organisation if that is not your core? Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe it's just about kind of showing that, you know, maybe kind of one of the people on your team has a BAME background of sorts. I don't know. Maybe it's like ensuring that one of your, like, a researcher is Black or Asian, and that's enough to qualify. I've got no idea, actually.
I think sometimes it's the people making the decisions that haven't got a clue. They'll say something's excellent, and to us, we'd say it's actually not. Or they don't know how to be a bit more discerning or have rigor around that process because they're not the right people to be making those decisions in the first place.
If we can return to the Q&A just for the next 5 minutes. There's a great question from Dennis that says, do the panelists think the concept of decolonization is a useful concept? What might be the first steps to decolonizing cultural practice and spaces? So I suppose the term decolonization gained greater circulation around in the aftermath of the Edward Colston statue within the British press, within cultural industries. So who finds decolonizing an interesting and important concept?
I think it's very important, especially when it comes to education at school level, because that determines what our children read and what they learn. I mean, for example, I don't need to look at any statue or King Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth I. I know who they are, because that's been taught at me at school level. And so we really need to consider, well, not to consider, but implement certain texts where our young people can learn about different narratives, not just the same old that I was educated at school by. And so there has to be a change there, I think, and that would be a much more lasting impact than tossing Edward Colston statue into Bristol Harbour. I feel very strongly about this. It's one of the motivations why I wrote Cane Warriors, because I believe that the UK needs to learn about, well, not learn, but let go and unleash, if you like, our narratives out there in the school curriculum and beyond. Because for so long, our narratives have been hidden away. They've not been given the priority. It's shocking that when I go into schools, young people, wherever you go, from Scotland to Cornwall, don't know about what happened in Jamaica. That even Jamaica had slaves and so on. I've had that conversation in schools, and young people say, "What? There were slaves in Jamaica? I thought that was only America." So there's this great history, great colonial history, the stain, if you like, in UK history that is always kind of been in denial. And so I'd like to reintroduce that and make young people aware of what's happened and what this country is responsible for.
I think decolonization is a useful starting point. I think a lot of conversations that I've encountered is how they talk about it in South Africa, where there's a lot of text around it and there's a lot of debate around it. It's very different to here. And can you really truly decolonize if you're speaking in English and you're taking on some of the ways and the standards? We're so tangled within that. I think it comes up all the time, but I think Alex is right. We need to at least start to deconstruct all these different narratives and represent more of those hidden histories or underrepresented histories. My younger brother and sister went to school from the age of 11 in Nigeria. My sister knows nothing about English history. She's all about West African history. And so her context and the way that she looks at the world is very, very different to mine, simply because she had those few years learning about the history of where my parents came from. So I think there is something about that decolonization, deconstructing narratives and really unpacking them, because we've been doing it. And I mean, you're always learning, but some people are coming to the table for the first time, and it must be quite scary figuring out that you've been told this very, very narrow story. And I think that right now, there's a lot of curiosity, I feel.
And Anamik, that term decolonization has obviously been a mainstay in academia for many years. Do you find it a useful concept?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely become a very fashionable concept. I mean, in terms of like kind of highlighting the way in which the way we understand the world, certainly in the UK, is formed through a Eurocentric lens, and trying to deconstruct that and foreground kind of the perspective, seeing if you like, recreating history through the eyes and the narratives of the marginalized. I mean, that's, for me, that's bang on. You know, there's always this moral panic, isn't there, that, you know, kind of, you know, these great white men are being removed from the canon. No one's being removed, but we're just challenging the default. You know, that's how I see it. At the same time, when my institution, when you know, senior management, my institution kind of very comfortably used the term decolonizing, then I'm sorry, but all of a sudden I'm like, oh, there's another word gone. We've got to come up with something else, quite frankly. And the appropriation of this language I find really interesting, the way in which these institutions kind of can take on that language. You know, I don't want to be all kind of polemical about it. Sometimes there's some real genuine a genuine urge from that members of the dominant culture to learn and relearn and unlearn, right? To use another part of the decolonizing vernacular. But sometimes when those words kind of get taken up in that way, all of a sudden they kind of very quickly lose their power. So the question is whether do we want to fight for that term, or do we move on and find something? Because this is the way power relations work, right? Over language. And
it's not just about reintroducing our narratives or texts. It's also about recorrecting truths. Like, I remember I was watching this debate about Nelson the other day on a morning television program. I probably won't need to tell you who presented this. And but you know, out of all the attributes that this presenter felt Nelson had, no one seemed to know that Nelson operated in Jamaica, and he upheld slavery for many years in the Caribbean. No one, you know, it seems like people want to dodge or evade that issue, not even acknowledge that issue, that he upheld slavery. And so, yes, he may be a hero of Waterloo or whatever it was, but you have to recognize what he tried to uphold, what he did uphold. And so there needs to be a certain truth that needs to emerge about colonialism, about the British Empire, and so on. You know, so for me, that is decolonization as well, to unravel these truths and present it to our young and say, right, you know, Nelson did this, but he also did this.
There's some brilliant points in the questions around the hostile environment, more on criticism and religion. Someone asked, did you consider, should we have had some of the perpetrators, the white power holders, on this panel? But unfortunately, there was only space for the four of us. But I think I'd like to leave this conversation with final thoughts from each of you, responding to Tom's question, which is, how can social movements exert pressure to generate structural change? And maybe if I can extend that to audiences, cultural audiences and social movements. And if you could give it 30 seconds each, that would be ideal. Thank you. Maybe start with Anamik.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I think it has to happen at all levels. You know, like social media, for all its horrors and pain and triggering, it has enabled us to talk back to these institutions directly in a way that we haven't been able to. But also, I'm really interested in kind of seeing at the kind of political level, like, you know, what kind of lobbying is necessary in terms of actually to, like I say, I'm kind of interested in this notion of reparative justice, replacing this benign notion of diversity with this notion of reparative justice, which means the state owning up and recognizing its own complicity in the kind of, you know, in racist structures in society, and how can that be addressed economically? So that's a much bigger political question, which goes beyond creative and cultural industries. And I hope the Black Lives Matter protest, I think, has shifted it in that direction slightly. So I'd be interested in building on that.
Nikkei, 30 seconds on how can audiences generate structural change?
I was going to say what Anamik said. I do think it has to happen across sector. I think you have to value everyone. I think you have to value the contributions of everyone, and you have to value the fact that you need everyone to be on side. So what I liked about Black Lives Matter is my friend said that in Harlem, she heard Black Lives Matter and she looked out the window and it was a whole bunch of young white kids shouting Black Lives Matter, and it made her cry. And I got calls from all over America saying that actually it's great that other people are pushing the stories forward. It can't just come from us, it has to come from all over. That's all I would say.
And the final word to Alex, what can audiences and social movements, how can they exert pressure to change the structure?
We just saw this week how Piers Morgan was challenged, not just by Alex Beresford, the weather presenter, but I think in that single day there were over 41,000 complaints about his approach to the Meghan issue with mental health and so on. And so privileged white men like that, even though they might not change their minds or might not change their mindset, at least they're on notice that if they spout their thoughts and their beliefs or whatever, they will be challenged. And I think we need to take that as a lesson that we can challenge. We have the medium now in social media to challenge these thoughts and mindsets, and perhaps not change their minds, but at least we can put up resistance in that way.
Thank you so much to our panelists, Anamik, Nikkei and Alex, and the supporters of this event, the Stuart Hall Foundation, Runnymede Trust and Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity. If people can fill in the survey of the EVEN survey, which is the Evidence for Equality National Survey, which documents the lives of minorities in a time of crisis, that would be great. And it's posted in the chat, so please fill in that survey. And thanks, this has been a wonderful conversation. It's ongoing. Do get in touch with the panelists on social media and various other outlets, and goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
See you. Bye.
Oh, God.